Hi, so today I'm actually to talk about self-advocacy in environments such as organizations where you may work, you may be educated, or even for yourself among family and friends, and how that actually adds to the diversity of things. Actually, should we be looking at that? Okay, all right, sorry. And one of those cases is that we only move forward if we actually take a self-advocacy role. And for me, it's my mileage may vary on this. It's my experience, but I also consider this the Schrodinger's approach. You never know what you're going to get until you actually kind of open that box. You may have a dead cat, you may have a live cat, to put it very simply. And in this case, you may find that you may have allies, you may have support, you may have folks that can kind of help you on your journey through your career, through your life, but you actually have to do it yourself. So a little bit about me. I want to give the standard disclaimer. This was merely just a presentation by myself, not on behalf of my employer or the federal government. The text there should generally kind of cover that. But who I am, this is kind of how I self-identify. I'm a human being, first and foremost, a geek. One of the reasons you show up here at DEF CON is that there's tons of very nerdy and geeky things to do. Everyone has a passion. I'm a techie. I find myself wandering around in the tech world, particularly security, but right now I'm actually a manager, but I try to be a technical manager. An activity freak. People thought it was very strange that I was spending the week going to the UNLV gym to swim and bike my butt off every morning, but I find that it's one of those things that kind of keeps me motivated, both at work and in my personal life. I self-identify as a woman, even though that may have not always been the case, and I fall under the LGBTQ category, particularly the bi and transgender identified side of things. So what keeps me going throughout the day? What pays for the roof over the head and food on the table? I'm the Deputy CIO at a federal agency. I work for the Department of Health and Human Services in the Inspector General's office, but again, I'm here on my own behalf. This has been an interesting journey from a systems administrator, systems engineer's perspective, graduating college, and finally getting into senior management. And a lot of changes have obviously occurred along the way, but it's one of those cases is the journey is only half the trip. I recently got the badge here as an InfoSec roadie this year, since I have now trekked my way across country to kind of help out with security conferences. I traditionally can be seen at B-Sides Nova and B-Sides DC, but this year was my first time being a volunteer at B-Sides Vegas. And finally, after so many years, I'm a DEF CON goon this year helping out in Schwag. So I like to give back to the community in any way as possible, hence the reason I'm also here talking at Hacking Diversity. Things I also like to do in my free time, with my wife, who's a wondrous musician, plays guitar. I have picked up learning to play drums, and we have jam sessions on a regular basis in our basement. She actually just blew up our car engine while trying to go out to a jam session when I wasn't here. So that's a big part of our life. And again, as I mentioned, I'm an activity freak, but I like to swim and bike. I used to do triathlon, and I ski. So if anyone out here wants to go and do that on occasion, that's my bag. So why am I here? So this is going to take the form of a long, potentially drawn out story, but generally it started as a child who was confused. Pulled back and forth between two parents who divorced when I was very early on and caused a lot of strife and confusion. To give a personal story of kind of how parents can affect your outcome is that you had to grow up very fast. And for me, it was taking in as much learning as possible, kind of being an adult in the room, even though I was very young. And that was the first step into self-advocacy. I realized that I actually had to be the person that was going to pretty much run my life. Fast forward many years later, as I was finding myself at a career crossroads, I also been through a very interesting marriage where it was, I would consider a loveless marriage, but it was over my gender identity. And I felt that at a very early age, and really kind of helped push it down for many, many years. And it was kind of tough during my employment because I was an angry individual and kind of couldn't find forward motion in my career. So I was generally a kind of a techie engineer and didn't do much with leading people. I was just kind of sitting back and letting myself go on autopilot. And finally came to a point where, on my way to DEF CON 17 in 2010, if I got the numbers right, I had taken a cross-country trip on motorcycle to get here. And that was 3,000 miles over 50 hours as part of an Iron Butt 50cc ride, and that means 50 hours cross-country. And that was to kind of go on a vision quest to find out, like, who am I really? What can I put myself through and give myself many hours on the bike, crossing country, seeing beautiful sights, and figuring out, what's going to make me happy, what's going to drive me for the rest of my life. And at that point in time, when I reached San Francisco, I realized that the only thing holding me back from being happy and being satisfied was myself. And once I got over that and found myself down here at Black Hat and DEF CON that year, I decided to kind of go and explore and try to be myself. I know this is the 15th year of QueerCon. I poked my head in, but it wasn't an actual official attendee. But I had made that decision at the point in time to actually transition. At the time, I was working for the U.S. Department of the Interior. I'd left a job working for supporting the Department of Defense. And the reason I had left is because I'd come to that crossroads and really needed to decide who I was going to be. And for that, I realized that I also needed to be that self-advocate. While we still had a very accepting executive leadership in the federal government, at the time, what was available in the way of policies and support was merely a couple executive orders and a letter or directive from the Office of Personnel Management to help people reconstruct their personnel folders. All the paperwork involved, as it would be for the government, to ensure that you could transition from one gender to another gender, or address all the fun paperwork of name changes and social security number changes and insurance and how where you're going to work and how you're going to come to work and which bathrooms you're going to use, which is the whole other discussion itself, and what kind of work you'll be doing at work. So about a year later, I went full-time at work, and during that time of going through and getting to that day, I had begun that route of self-advocacy. I reached out to people that I needed to ask questions about. First, it was just an HR person who worked across the hall, and built up a rapport and friendship, and decided to ask a question when no one else was in the office. Everyone's going to kind of find a safe, comfortable, reliable space for that. And they started putting me in touch with some of the senior leaders in the agency. Actually, one of them happened to be the Chief Human Capital Officer, since I worked in headquarters. And with my agency, they'd had a very difficult time with folks who had potentially transitioned beforehand. There's a lot of stories that folks there said that, hey, we had a really bad time, so we want to handle this potentially a lot better. So they took an active role. And seeing that there was at least one ally, and I found out that my senior the deputy assistant director of my own branch was not only an advocate, but was part of the LGBT community. So I had support from two very high up people. And that showed that while you had allies, you also had to kind of go and seek that support. But it also, as we're talking here about kind of hacking diversity, was finding that there are diverse leaders, folks above you, peers and so forth, that are available once you kind of start to stick your head out. It's scary, it's potentially dangerous depending on those environments, but that's kind of what's necessary. Before the talk had actually started here, I talked to some of the people in the room and was indicating that after that I had started reaching out to some of my support network to find some help, making sure that while I was new at this, I could find my way to start to sound like an expert. I'd reach out to folks who are in other agencies, other organizations, both large and small, to see if they had any work developing policy or knew any policy to basically help somebody in the LGBT community address HR issues. Anywhere within our agency, we had uniforms.
Yeah.
that were handed out to park rangers, to obviously the bathroom issue, but also with a lot of various things to concern about medical. People may go out for long periods of time to address medical issues and also need aftercare. And while I found at least 2 advocates and allies within my senior chain, the issue was everyone else I worked with wasn't necessarily as open or aware of that. So bringing a stack of documents that literally, when printed out, was about that high to start crafting a policy and being engaged. That was a key point for me. It was a key point for folks I work with, that we constantly communicated. We were very open, we were very honest. They were very good at asking questions. They wanted to make sure this was going to be right. In fact, I actually kind of had to explain the whole process of transition on a whiteboard. I was actually very proud of that because I love whiteboards. I love being able to kind of draw and kind of, visually explain all of this stuff. And that was one of those cases while I was in the room. I wasn't necessarily the person that was going to author, going to rewrite it, putting words to paper, but I was actually getting people in the same mindset that they needed to be. Fast forward a bit later, I actually took the leadership role of the agency's LGBTQ employee organization. I originally had volunteered as a webmaster to kind of get them, so they were helping with communications, but I decided to also take over leadership of it, and given the fact that the folks who were running it had been there from the start and were actually getting ready to retire. And by actually doing that, it actually helped me reach out to other folks within the agency and finding out how many people, some closeted, some not open, some not out, other allies, and other people within the community that were actually available to bounce some ideas off of, but also they knew people that were trusted individuals who, when they ran into someone in the agency that had an issue, it was just kind of a conduit. And that actually acts as another level of self-advocacy, is that you kind of work that whole bit where you try to find somebody who will be willing to listen to you and kind of make a welcoming environment to kind of include you on things. The other issue was here with the agency's LGBT community was that we needed to make sure that we partook in all the work that the agency was out and doing. Shortly before I left, the National Park Service had started an LGBT heritage project. So that brought executive people down from Glesson and HRC and a bunch of other organizations to start to identify that. And the agency, because we were a reasonably large LGBTQ employee organization, but because I'd known the people at that higher level, they brought us in. And then we kind of expanded that network further. And that was another case of, you need to be your own advocate by trying to keep involved. But what I'm going to go here from here, outside of my story, is the importance of self-advocacy. The key thing here is it's an empowering thing. Like when you are standing out and you are going to try to stick your head out to advance an I would say an agenda, but your desires to kind of make things better for yourself, it is really empowering. It's a little bit of kind of a little endorphin rush. Like when you actually achieve something, you feel like you're moving the ball forward. You're seeing some change. The other thing, as I mentioned before, one of the cases I liked doing that sketch on the whiteboard was education. Not everybody you're going to be working with for your own self-advocacy are going to be knowledgeable about what you're doing. So this not only helps you refine your message, but it also educates the people you're going to be talking to. They may not be of the group that you're advocating for. They may not be a racial minority. They may not be a gender minority. They may not be a sexual preference minority. They may be not the religious minority. They may not even be folks that understand what you do for a day job. If you're a technical engineer and you're trying to explain all these weird points and you're talking to someone who may be HR or a business major or somebody like that, it gives you a chance to basically kind of work through your message, kind of refine that, get questions from that, and it makes you a better self-advocate. The other point too is awareness. It gets you a chance to let folks know, again, who may not be within the community that you're representing. Gives them a chance to be aware that this community actually exists. A lot of times I know some people here probably from startups, you've got, probably less than 50, sometimes less than 20 people, or even less than 10 people, that you may be that only person in that room that represents that group. So when they're making decisions about the business, about the organization, they're not considering that. So if you're not standing up for yourself, you're not basically advocating your position, your identity. They make decisions about health insurance. They may make decisions about policies and behavior of other staff. And if you make that aware through your own self-advocacy, you can affect change there. And as your organization potentially grows, from a startup to potentially something that's acquired, or even grow to a potential multinational, international conglomerate, that kind of gets built in from scratch. That's not so much etched in stone, but it's there from the start. It's that foundation. And then the self-advocacy point of completeness is if you're there long enough and you stick there long enough, you see things through to completion. You get something you can kind of put a stamp on and it's been enacted. And that's a good, warm, fuzzy feeling. Like when I saw the trans and non-binary employee policy in Interior get sent up to be included in the Department of Interior's actual handbook, and there was a stamp on there. It was dated. It was signed. It was literally waiting for the secretary's signature. That meant that that thing was completed, that this is how things are going to run from here on out. And that's that positive feedback loop you get, that you've seen something to completion. It's a little bit of pay it forward. You have something that's there and it's official, and that you're actually advocating on someone's behalf that you may not even know. The other aspect of a little bit of the completeness is you have some control. Since you're involved, you're there, you can kind of help steward things through that process. So, again, if you're the only voice in the room that's potentially representing that community, you have that ability to kind of direct that. If it could be a group of 3 people doing it, it could be a group of 20, where you're that person in the room that's representing it. You can provide a little bit of that control. You can ensure that it's not going to go off the rails. And as I mentioned before about the completeness, there's the legacy aspect of your self-advocacy. Again, there's nowadays in the tech community, no one's going to stick at the same company organization for more than 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, like our parents may have. So what you create ends up being a legacy. So you're helping people you don't necessarily know, and that ability there is it's a level of empowerment to tie that loop back around, but it's also providing something you can kind of point back to. For instance, when I was at Disney, when I was interviewing at Disney, they're asking, one of the interview questions was, what was the most important thing that you've done in your career in the last couple of years, and what are you most proud of? And I'm kind of thinking back to like all the technical stuff. I've worked for critical infrastructure organizations. I've done stuff with the public sector. I worked for small startups. I've even been at the White House. But the fact is like taking that time to help build that policy and being involved was actually the thing I was most proud of. It was totally out of my wheelhouse. I'm not an HR person. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not, up until now, not a senior leader. But that was a legacy I left for folks to draw from after I'd been gone. However, none of this is easy. None of it at all. So I mentioned awareness. So that's kind of a double-edged sword. Once you stick your head out, people know you're that person. I think just before we started here, we were talking about the challenges of being kind of to take a Lee Honeywell comment, the tall poppy aspect of this is that you could potentially become a target. You're going to be walking around with a target on your back for folks who may not understand or may not agree with what you're trying to advocate. But the awareness is too, is you build up those allies for advancing that diverse environment that you'll be in. And, because that, you start to build an army almost. You have folks who are going to get your back as much as people are going to start to shoot arrows in your back. So that is a massive challenge in a diverse environment. As it starts to spread, the awareness can be a double-edged sword. The other challenge is willingness. Organizations have a certain level of inertia that must be overcome. With that, depending on the size, depending on the political makeup sometimes, depending on timing, it's in certain cases where, it just may not be the right time to kind of push this thing through because other potential more important things are going on. That's That's a self-awareness aspect. If you're going to self-advocate for yourself, you kind of need to have understanding of the timing of the situation. Sometimes it's good to introduce your own self-advocacy in a time of chaos, because sometimes folks aren't paying attention. Other times you may want a quiet time, so you get that kind of attention, and you get the full attention of folks that may help things along. Challenges for a lot of times for yourself is resources. If you're in a small organization, they may not have money, they may not have staff, they may not have policies in place, they just may not have anything that can kind of help you. And that may be where you much like teachers are required to bring in and pay for their own supplies, you may have to kind of go out and scrounge your own resources, or find people in the community or other allies outside of your organization to kind of help you through this. Anywhere, as I mentioned before, I had a stack of policy papers that people provided to me. If I had to generate that on my own, I don't think a lot of the stuff would have come to fruition. Challenges too is, as I mentioned before about completeness, is also the follow through. Being a self-advocate, being an advocate of any kind, is exhausting work. There are people who burn out every day. You hear these stories of people like flipping out, or just exiting this environment entirely because it's just been too much work. It's a very Sisyphean effort a lot of times. And that's people talk about self-care. And that's very important. Sometimes you can get so wrapped up in trying to advocate for a certain position, trying to get more inclusive, trying to get someone to see your perspective. And that's going to basically just burn you out after a while, because you feel you may not be getting traction, or it's just like that's the only thing that's cycling through your head. But after a while, if you continue to follow through and you kind of be that tie into the next one, the thorn in the side, you may actually see some movement. As I was talking earlier before the talk as well, was persistence. One of those cases is that that thorn in the side methodology. You can be that blunt object. You come in and say, this needs to get done, it needs to get done now. Otherwise, you can say you're going to lose a very valuable resource. If you know your self-worth as a diverse individual within the team or the organization, some people may be not aware that that's what you bring to the table. And if you decide to kind of push an effort, they'll look at the work that you do, the contributions you make to an organization, and say, well, I'm going to kind of cash in on that value and try to push something forward. And that persistence that you'll have there is saying, hey, if you're not going to listen to me, I'm going to leave. But I'm also going to poke on this if you are willing to move forward. So I'm not going to just say it and leave the room. I'm going to say it, and I'm going to come back to it, and come back to it, and come back to it, so I see forward motion. Now, in certain cases, like I say, a government agency, it may take a while. It took us, I think, about 2 years to actually get the policy out the door. But it was constantly sending a reminder on your calendar, follow up with so-and-so, see where things are, get feedback, track that, ensure that there's that follow through, but also, you can't just kind of sit back on coast. If you want to see your organization change, you want to get more minorities in, or people with different backgrounds, you need to actually be that person kind of pushing it. Because a lot of times, just like my current job right now, is I'm pushing, having to manage our budget. I'm pushing for some HR changes, trying to help with hiring, but I'm also trying to do my day job with dealing with strategy for our organization and trying to coordinate among my divisions. So it's trying to find those time slices to be persistent, to address kind of your little pet projects. It's extreme challenge. It's time management. It's that self-care component. Again, then there's also challenges in efficacy. In a small organization, one person can make a lot of change, but they can also make very little change, because if you encounter a lot of resistance, it's going to be very difficult to see that change move forward. So again, I talk about timing, about being the self-advocate. Efficacy is proportional to the awareness and the ability for folks to kind of help you along. So when you choose to advocate for a particular change or an addition to your organization or a policy or a procedure, do you want to start small? Do you want to go out with a big bang? what's the biggest bang for the buck that you can get for the effort? So, if, in my case, developing an HR policy, it was kind of middle of the road. I had no idea how many people were going to affect with this. For all I know, there could have been, sub 10 trans and non-binary people in my agency. Or there could have been hundreds, folks who weren't out or weren't open about their identity, or anything else related to that, because there wasn't a policy. There was nothing they could refer to. So that's one of those cases is this just for me or is it for somebody else? And down the road, is this going to be effective? Is it going to need to be revisited? Is it going to need extra revisions as things change, as environments change? Not to get too political, but I see that as we ingrain that policy now 4 years ago at Interior, it's part of how the agency works. It's not something that's going to get rolled back by law, or it could be. It's not going to be subject to the whims of a current administrator within the agency. It's part of how we do business. So it's a matter of kind of finding the point that's gonna last and it's going to be effective. So finally, there's things to discuss about the results. So being a self-advocate, it can help you resolve issues. For me, being who I am, it's one of those cases that I don't like to go to bed without making sure that everything is nice and neat and resolved. I don't like to go to bed angry. So, seeing something through and getting to that point allows you to kind of sleep at night. Your stress level can go down. You feel like you have that sense of accomplishment, but it's also potentially like if you run into something throughout your day or what you do for work or your activities or work with family and friends, once it's in place, you can kind of refer to it. It's like, hey, we agreed on this. This is what we're sticking to. And there's less arguments potentially down the road. Again, as I mentioned too, is in an organization, as you work through this thing, you can uncover similar situations. When I was at Disney, they have an internal social network. I'm not going to mention which product it is, but it's Facebook-like, but it's also very open, but it's governed. So the discussions on there within the LGBT groups and the women and technology groups get spirited at times. Some folks are just kind of passive and like to sit back and discuss just the wondrous aspects of being in the organization, which is great. As a company goes, I really enjoyed my time there and found that the level of diversity of experiences just within the category of women, female identified individuals at Disney was amazing. I was more amazed, not just the fact that there's a lot of women there, but there was just a lot of diverse backgrounds, talking to people who were data specialists or people who work parks or folks who designed video games or folks who were designing toys or who worked on films or even just the lawyers and accountants. I mean, there was just the fact is that this was an environment that the organization created to allow that free exchange of ideas. Conversely, on the LGBT side of things, that was also a group when they were developing products. This was a place where they could go and ask questions that were very specific to a particular group. So one of those cases that I believe was one of the marketing departments was trying to design a form and seeing how many questions they needed to have on there to get the information they needed to have. So we got into the discussion of, do we need questions about gender or age or very specific personally identifiable type kind of details, and bringing it to that group to kind of have a discussion on what's the minimum amount that we feel that would actually achieve that. But marketing people sometimes tend to want the world, and you need to kind of help narrow that focus, both to provide comfort for groups that may be interacting with that they weren't potentially aware of, but also ensure that at the risk side of things, you're not collecting more, that if there was a breach, thinking security, if there was a breach, that data could be potentially used against those people. So it's kind of creating that surface area that was much more reduced. But those environments like that is allows you to kind of uncover those similar situations, find people who are of the same mind, maybe working on different types of work, or may have experiences that they need another perspective on. Or again, from my perspective here as a self-advocate, is going out there and saying, hey, I've run into this issue as a new employee. Can anybody help through sharing their experiences of potentially being a new employee with this particular issue, or finding resources in a particular area. Like for me, living in LA, and I had people in Seattle to know what's the change in the environment, or there was a network if I needed to go up to Seattle to go for a meeting, other people I could connect with to kind of help me out if I had particular issues. Again, increasing visibility. It's on all 3 slides. Your mileage may vary. That's the YMMV. Your mileage may vary. It's a double-edged sword. So you stick your head out. You're then potentially the go-to person. So be prepared to get a lot of questions. If you're not willing to kind of be the person who is I hate to say this, the token individual, representing that group, but also being open to kind of redirect as well. Your network. You could literally just be kind of that router. You're just directing traffic. But if you're out there and about, you're increasing the visibility of yourself, but you may just be that traffic router. Technical conference, and I'm using those terms. But that's the thing for me. I've become less of a techie, but I've become more of a super connector. It's just the kind of the people who but also, the thing is that people come to you with very unique questions, and it gets a chance to kind of ponder that in your head. Like, oh, I never thought of that. So it gets you to kind of rethink your own situation. Again, the results about self-confidence and enablement. It's in that empowerment aspect. I feel I'm a more effective leader and more effective individual because I've gone through this process. I've advocated through it. I've grown a spine. I'd be walking around like this all the time because I hated life and I hated my situation. And now, I'll come to a conference here and I'll talk very freely about it. I'll not so much say as a subject matter expert, but also, know that, damn, I'm good at this. You get by that imposter syndrome. Oh, I'm not good enough to kind of present female, or I'm not techie enough to be at this conference, or I don't know so much about this subject area. And you sit there and go, no, I'm a valued individual. I'm a valued person. And, that self-worth is a very big thing. I think that we, especially not only in the LGBT community, women, or even just in the tech community, we get that imposter syndrome. It's like, well, we're not good enough. It's like, I can't present at DEF CON, or I can't do this thing. And you're going like, damn it, I need to be there. I need to be in this space. And you argue for your point to be in there, and you get in there and you realize that they may want someone like you in there. That's not just, it's like, you're not forcing diversity upon them, but you're getting yourself injected in there. You're doing some packet injection. And you're getting into that space, and you're like, wow, this is much better. It's like, if you're going to be in a D&D group or something like that, no one's going to expect that this weird paladin's going to come in and change everything. This is a good benefit, because now you have a questing team that'll actually end up being much better for you being there. Again, concrete references. If no one knows what's going to happen unless you do it. So if you're not going to be contributing to developing a policy or leading people or trying to change minds and behavior through the additions of bringing diverse workforces in, bringing folks who are neurodiverse. That's been a big argument here in DC is they run into this issue of trying to get more and more people into the InfoSec workforce there, and they're struggling like, oh, we've got all these openings, we don't know how to hire people. And I go into the roles where I'm sitting with C-level people, and I'm like, well, it's not that difficult to find us. Like, we're out there. Some of us have been looking for jobs for a while. Well, what's the reason we may not hire you? Well, I like to work late, so I'm not going to do the 9 to 5 thing. I may be neurodiverse, so I may be an ASPE, to put it lightly, or you may have some other emotional or mental requirements. You may. Sometimes they're just intrinsic biases. I hate to say this, is like you got the bro culture in tech sometimes, and they don't want to hire women because they just kind of get along, and that women are icky and scary. Or even within heterosexual straight groups, and you come in and you're queer, and you're like, oh, is that person looking at me as a potential date? Or it's that threat environment. But it's really not that. It's you're in here. You're bringing something to the table, and when you start talking to the senior leaders, just like, hey, if you're looking to bring more and more folks in, you need to kind of like open up your scope and be okay with that. Finding people like, hey, sometimes they may smoke a joint because that's what gets them through the day. It's not that they're shooting up with heroin or they're driving around drunk or anything. This is literally kind of a mood altering thing. But if we get over some of these minor things for security clearance, or we provide a welcoming environment, people sometimes like to work with the lights down low and no noise, or in an isolated room instead of an open plan workspace. That's where you're going to get these people who are going to kind of willing to join your organization. So that's one of those cases of trying to be in that space, argue, self-advocate, not just for yourself if you are part of that community, but realize that those are the types of people that are out there. And if you really want to make a better workspace and an environment, or even your family, like include some people who are a little, that crazy uncle, bring them in. But that's just one of those cases there. And if you can, those concrete references, you point back to an organization that actually did that and saw them advance, that's always one of those benefits there. And as I mentioned before too about that legacy, that's the chance that once you move, you have a chance to bring those lessons learned to a new organization that may not have those. So kind of that iterative process, that the SDLC of diversity, I guess, in a way. And then you're paying it forward. So you leave, but if you've left a legacy document or a policy or an experience, like sometimes you may be the only queer person that they've ever met, or somebody from another country that may speak or have a different culture. You leave a good impression there, they're more willing to kind of backfill you with someone else who may be like you or with those particular characteristics. So unfortunately, since we're a little sparse in the room, the discussion is probably going to be a little bit less, but I consider these your TTPs, so I was hoping people would provide some input as they may have self-advocated an environment as to what's worked and what hasn't worked for them, and maybe we can work through a couple issues. Thank you.
Thank you.